When I was little, I was very prone to car sickness. As a result, my family would often leave me in the house for days during the vacation season. I appreciated the time to myself and would spend it writing, drawing, or watching television with the volume up far too loud. However, once night fell and my eyelids drew heavy, anxiety would flood through me. I'd become jumpy, catching reflections in the movement of every window and mirror. Once, this drove me to do something I've since regretted. I simply left the light in the hall on, allowing it to shine into my bedroom from the thin crack below the door. A few years ago, I used to pick a few old, worn-out records from the bins at my thrift store every time I passed by. It was a little thing I did to keep myself amused. Playful polka anthologies, horror sound effects records, a spoken class in aerobatics, hypnosis records to help you quit smoking, and even one record proudly bearing the title, Music for Expectant Fathers. Amongst my ever-growing pile of useless old records was one warped old album held in a plain brown sleeve, its label worn and illegible. It being one of the better albums that had turned up in my collection, I would listen to it often. After a few weeks of having that singular record on heavy rotation, I was infatuated by a funny little thought. With each play of the album, the singer seemed to sound just a little more exhausted. It became an exercise. I listened for new signs of fatigue with every repetition. With each periodical reoccurrence of that album on my turntable, I was almost certain the soloist grew more exasperated, and the instrumentation grew more stumbling and jagged. Over the passage of time, I grew more and more weary of playing the record, especially when I was alone in the house. A few years ago, I traded in my old record player at the thrift store and got an MP3 player.
Oh, Jim, my baby man called Jim all over me.
The average person spends 1/3 of their life sleeping. That's a total of roughly 194,820 hours. While it varies from person to person, a sound louder than 40 decibels is usually enough to keep someone awake. However, once the subject is sleeping, it usually requires a disturbance louder than 60 decibels to wake them. This is roughly as loud as a dishwasher or dryer if you were seated next to it. Luckily, most things aren't that loud. Last winter, a friend and I decided to do a little urban exploration. The small town we live in shares its borders with a lot of old farmland, so we really had our pick of the litter as far as locations go. We finally settled on an old 2-story farmhouse, only a short walk to the southeast of where I live. Here's a little footage. Sorry about the audio quality. Oh yeah, so while we were in the basement of the farmhouse, I nearly tripped on something in the dark. Turns out it was a virtually new digital camera. I picked it up, turned it on, snapped a picture just to see if it still worked. Surprisingly, it's in perfect shape. I didn't notice I had video on it until I got back home. By the way, these are the recordings that were on it when I found it. Oh, and if you're curious, here's the picture I snapped in the basement. I've always been a bit of a curious person. Over the last few weeks, I've noticed that some of my clothing stored in my dresser has been a little disarranged, to say the least. I'm fairly organized, so the mystery of how my things ended up in a less than pristine state had been gnawing at the back of my mind. Now, mind you, the changes have all been quite innocent in nature. I like to organize things by size, and a few articles of clothing would end up crumpled or in the wrong order. It reared itself as a topic of conversation a few times, each ending with the same conclusion. I should videotape my dresser while I was out of the house. Having assumed my sister to be the culprit, the goal was to catch her in the act. I placed the video camera within a box so as to conceal my motives and went about my day, allowing the camera to film until it ran out of tape. Now, you're going to have to trust me on this, but you don't want to see what comes next. From the Net Nostalgia Local Television Forums. Subject: Candle Cove Local Kids Show. Sky Sail 033. Does anyone remember this kids show? It was called Candle's Cove, and I must have been 6 or 7. I never found any reference to it anywhere, so I think it was on a local station around 71 or 72. I lived in Ironton at the time. I don't remember which station, but I do remember it was on at a weird time, like 4 p.m. Mike Painter, 65. It seems really familiar to me. I grew up outside of Ashland and was 9 years old in 72. Candle Cove, was it about pirates? I remember a pirate marionette at the mouth of the cave talking to a little girl. Skysail 033. Yes, okay, I'm not crazy. I remember Pirate Percy. I was always kind of scared of him. He looked like he was built out of other parts of dolls, real low budget. His head was an old porcelain baby doll. It looked like an antique that didn't belong in the body. I still don't remember what station this was. I don't think it was WTSF, though. Jaren 2005. Sorry to resurrect this old thread, but I know exactly what you mean, Sky's Hail. I think Candle Cove ran only for a few months in 71, not 72. I was 12 and I watched it a few times with my brother. It was channel 58, whatever station that was. My mom would let me switch to it after the news. Let me see what I remember. It took place in Candle Cove and was about a little girl who imagined herself to be friends with pirates. The pirate ship was called Laughingstock, and Pirate Percy wasn't a very good pirate because he got scared too easily. And there's calliope music playing constantly. Don't remember the girl's name. Janice or Jade or something. I think it was Janice. Skysail 033. Thank you, Jaren. Memories flooded back when you mentioned the Laughingstock and Channel 58. I remember the bow of the ship was a wooden, smiling face with a lower jaw submerged. It looked like it was swallowing the sea and had that awful Ed Wynn voice and laugh. I especially remember how jarring it was when they switched from the wooden or plastic model to the foam puppet version of the head that talked. Mike Painter, 65. I remember that too. Do you remember this part, Sky's Hill? You have to go inside. Sky's Hill 033. Ugh, Mike, I got a chill just reading that. Yes, I remember. That's what the ship always told Percy when there was a spooky place and he had to go in, like a cave or a dark room where treasure was. And the camera would push in on Laughingstock's face with each pause. You have to go inside. With his 2 eyes askew and that flopping foam jaw and the fishing line that opened and closed it. It just looks so cheap and awful. You guys remember the villain? He had a face that was just a handlebar mustache above really tall, narrow teeth. Kevin Hart. I honestly thought the villain was Pirate Percy. I was about 5 when this show was on. Jaren, 2005. That wasn't the villain, the puppet with the mustache. That was the villain's sidekick, Horace Horrible. He had a monocle, too, but it was on top of the mustache. I used to think it meant he only had one eye. But yeah, the villain was another marionette, the Skin Talker. I can't believe they let us watch that back then. Kevin Hart. What kind of kid show were we watching? I seriously could not look at the screen when the Skin Talker showed up. He just descended out of nowhere on his strings, just a dirty skeleton wearing that brown top hat and the cape. His glass eyes were far too big for that skull. Christ almighty. Sky's Hail 033. Wasn't his top hat and cloak all sewn up all crazy? Wasn't that supposed to be children's skin or something? Mike Painter, 65. Yeah, I think so. Remember, his mouth didn't open and close? His jaw just slid back and forth. I remember the little girl said, "Why does your mouth move like that?" And the Skin Talker didn't look at the girl, but looked to the camera and said, "To grind your skin." Skies Hill 033. I'm so relieved that other people remember this terrible show. I used to have this awful memory, a bad dream I had where the opening jingle ended, the show faded in from black and all the characters were there, but the camera was just jutting to each of their faces and they were just screaming, and the puppets and marionettes were flailing spastically, just all screaming. The girl was just moaning and crying like she had been through hours of this. I woke up many times from that nightmare. I used to wet the bed when I had it. Kevin Hart. I don't think that was a dream. I remember that was an episode. Skies Hill 033. No, that's not possible. There was no plot or anything. I mean, it was literally just standing in place crying and screaming for the whole show. Kevin Hart. Maybe I'm manufacturing this memory because you said it, but I swear to God I remember seeing what you just described. They just screamed. Jaren 2005. Oh, God, yes, the little girl, Janice, I remember seeing her shake, and the skin talker screaming through his gnashing teeth, his jaw careening so wildly I thought it would come off its wire hinges. I just turned it off, and that was the last time I watched. I ran to tell my brother, and we didn't have the courage to turn it back on. Mike Painter, 65. I visited my mom today at the nursing home. I asked her about when I was little in the early 70s, when I was 8 or 9, and if she remembered a kid's show, Candle Cove. She said she was surprised I could remember that, and I asked why. She said, "Because I used to think it was so strange that you said, 'I'm gonna go watch Candle Cove now, Mom,' and then you'd turn the TV to static and just watch dead air for 30 minutes. You had such a big imagination with your little pirate show." On March 18th, 2003, a 15-year-old boy in a small Maryland town sat down at his computer after getting home from school. He turned it on, logged on to AIM, and was surprised to receive an instant message from a classmate of his who had been absent that day. It consisted of 2 words: "Please come." Confused, the boy sent a reply, asking why he'd been absent that day. After 2 more messages in 15 minutes with no response, he decided to get on his bike and head over to the classmate's house. It was a short ride, only about 5 minutes away. When he got to the house, he found the door was unlocked. Inside, partially dried blood coated the walls and floors, and an unrecognizable figure missing an arm and a leg lay crumpled against the far wall. Bloody streaks on the floor led away from the body and into the kitchen. The boy slammed the door shut and immediately called 911 on his cell phone. When the police arrived, they found 3 corpses. The forensics report concluded that the entire family, the boy's classmate and his parents, had been killed sometime during the previous night. The 4th body was found underneath the student's bed after the initial sweep during cleanup. Left without any appendages or teeth, it remains unidentified, but had been dead a whole 72 hours longer than the others.
Hey, Bubby. Are you ready to go for a walk? Are you ready to go for a walk, Shadow? Shadow.
This is the Roundhay garden scene, the earliest surviving motion picture shot in 1888 in the Leeds garden of Joseph and Sarah Whitley. The scene is only 2 seconds long, but it seems to have conveyed a queer curse. Sarah died only 10 days after the shoot. Director Louis Le Prince vanished from a French train 2 years later, and actor Alphonse de Prince was found dead of a gunshot in 1902.
Here's an interesting clip from a medical podcast that I listened to that I thought you should hear. Afterwards, there'll be a game. Okay.
I've seen these patients in my clinic who are convinced, despite all rational conversation, that they have a disease they don't have. My favorite and most disgusting was a patient who had delusions of parasitism, and he brought in a large jar of all the parasites that he'd been collecting. He dumped them on the table in front of me, and I asked them where they came from. He said he pulled them out of his nose every day. He brought in a big jar of dried boogers. He also ate a raw garlic every minute to keep these parasites away, and I could not eat garlic for a year after seeing this patient. You may think this is an extreme example of patients with a fixed idea of their illness, but I assure you, it is not.
Now that you've heard that, I'd like you to watch the next 20-second video, and then I'll pose my question to you after the video is finished. Does your nose feel itchy?
Every year around Christmas, 2 or 3 snow globes seem to surface from the brown cardboard boxes in the basement and perch themselves around the house like little glass birds. This one is my favorite. It's not particularly old or special. I just like that it has a little wind-up box built in. I always found the mechanism fascinating. When I was younger, I'd wind it up over and over again, putting it to my ear and listening to all the gears turning inside of it. That's how I noticed a small peculiarity in its function. After the music box bends its last note, I could sometimes hear a little whine come from within it, distinct from the toiling of the cogwheels. I tried to record it here in this video. Did you hear it? When I was a child, I lived in a rented 2-floor house. Both my parents worked, so I was often alone when I came home from school. One early evening when I came home, the house was still dark. I called out, "Mom," and heard a voice say, "Yes," from upstairs. I called my mom again and got the same "yes" reply. I felt she was calling back at me and climbed the stairs. When I reached the first floor, I called once more, and the voice came from the furthest room. But just that moment, I heard the front door downstairs open and my mother come in, carrying a lot of shopping bags. "Sweetie, are you home?" my mother called in a cheery voice. Hearing her voice made me feel instantly better, and I turned back to go downstairs at once, but not before I had a quick glance towards my room. While I watched from the top of the stairs, the door to the room slowly opened a crack. For a brief moment, I saw something strange in there. In France, a young ambient musician by the name of Charles Laurent undertook an interesting new project. He was going to record the sound of himself sleeping and release it under the name Nuit, the night in English. Charles lived alone in a rural area, which would remove elements like car alarms or traffic from the recording. He planned his project for many months, acquiring the sensitive equipment to capture all of the outside noises, as well as his own during sleep. Finally, on the 27th of September, he decided to execute his plan. He set up all of his equipment and fell asleep at midnight. The next day, Charles reviewed the recording. For the first hour, the recording played his own tossings and turnings, as well as some distant dog barks and a few car alarms. These continued throughout the second hour as well, until Charles heard something that horrified him. Exactly 3 hours and 24 minutes in, the recording played the sound of his bedroom door opening. There are stories about a certain kind of hitchhiker. They only ever appear at night on quiet roads, seeming to flicker into existence at the edge of headlights, never carrying a sign, always with an expression of deep despondency on their faces, swathed in a heavy coat and long pants, usually with gloves. If you stop, they seem cordial enough, polite, but hardly chatty. They'll assure you that the next town or city along your route will be a fine spot to leave them. Normal enough, unless you try killing them. They die easily enough, but look underneath their clothes and you will see that their skin is marred with the lines of scars, forming repeating patterns that are unsettling to look at, and even more unsettling in the context of their skin. They have no wallets or identification. If you slice their belly open, however, they're different inside. There is no blood, no muscle, only a hollow cavity containing a single object. The object varies. Examples include a single coin, heavy and golden, engraved with the runes nobody could ever decipher, a diamond gem with fractal edges that slice bare flesh to ribbons, a small vase, quite unbreakable, that smells of the ocean and is always damp. Once you possess a hitchhiker's object, you'll find yourself always driving the quiet roads at night. You'll never mean to, but somehow you will. The lure of possessing a second one will hum quietly in your head. You'll strain to catch the sight of a figure appearing in your headlights. Try to resist the impulse to stop, and sometimes you might. But sometimes you won't. You'll try telling yourself that this is just a normal person out on an adventure, someone who just ran out of gas. The logical part of your brain will scream at what you're doing, but you'll smile and nod, and they'll get into the car, and you'll slowly, casually, reach under the seat or across to the glove box. On the underside of your refrigerator, there's a switch. Reach under there and feel it. Don't mind the dust or the roaches. You'll know it when you feel it. It's a hard metal tab sticking out of the slot in the plastic underside. It will be set on the right-hand side. If you switch to the left, nothing will happen. Your appliances will continue to run. The floor won't open into a swirling vortex that leads directly into the deepest circle of hell. You won't even hear a hitch in the hum of the refrigerator. You'll get up and then brush off and go about your business. You may even move out and leave your old refrigerator behind. Switch still set to the left, like it doesn't matter. However, 2 days after your death, if someone were to look, they would find an odd number of fingers, toes, and eyes in the stomach of your corpse. This is a follow-up for Corrupted Bootleg, so please watch that first if you haven't already. Spiritual 101 writes, well, that was pretty strange. I've never seen the film, so I have no idea what the woman is saying at 0:30 seconds to 0:50 seconds. Is it possible for you to record and upload the corrupted footage to your computer and onto YouTube? A full screen of this would look pretty cool. Well, thank you for writing, and I'd love to oblige. The DVD ripping software already in my possession, I was able to get started on this right away. While the rip was more successful than I guessed it would be, the video still doesn't show up at all on this computer. Luckily, the audio is salvageable. I'll play the first 40 seconds for you now. I may as well note that I haven't seen this movie either, so I'm also clueless as to what the voice in the clip is saying. From that point onwards, the deep, crunching static growls monotonously on throughout the rest of what I was able to extract. As you can see and hear, it remains consistent. That is, with the exception of one 10-second period of whistling about 2.5 minutes in. Here's the isolated clip in waveform view. However, I first observed this file in spectral view, which allows the whistling much more visibility. Let me show you how that looks now. I'm bored of this. In the winter of 1944, with overtaxed supply lines in the Ardennes, a German medic had completely run out of plasma. bandages and antiseptic. During one particularly bad round of mortar fire, his encampment suddenly became a bloodbath. The survivors claimed to hear, above the screams and the barked commands of their lieutenant, someone cackling with an almost girlish glee. The medic made his rounds during the fire in almost complete darkness, as he had so many times before, but never had he made them while this short on supplies. The bombardment moved to other starts of the line, and most men dropped off to sleep in the dark. Still in the hours of the morning, New Year's Day, 1945. The men awoke at first light with screams. They had discovered that their bandages were not typical, but hunks and strips of human flesh. Several men had been given blood transfusions, yet there had been no blood supplies available. Each treated man was almost completely covered, head to toe, with the maroon stain of blood. The medic was found sitting on an ammunition tin, staring off into space. When one man approached him and tapped him on the shoulder, his tunic fell off to reveal that his skin, muscle, and sinew had been stripped from his torso, and his body was almost completely dried of blood. In one hand, a scalpel, and the other, a blood transfusion vial. None of the men treated for their wounds that night in that camp saw the end of January 1945. Hello. Hey, I'm sorry I haven't updated lately. If you noticed, I worked on this project through the holiday season, and now I'm taking my own personal 1-week break. I'll be back on Monday, though. Just during this time, I saw this, and I thought it would be fun to share here, so I don't know. Doesn't require any work on my part.
They're pretty and powerful. These flowers are causing a big stink in one Southland community.
Yeah, some say that these purple plants are a buddy and smelly problem, and they want them gone. It's a debate that's gone all the way to the city council.
And also to Brandon Rudout, who's live in Lawndale with the big fuss.
And it keeps smelling it. Brandon, what are you thinking? I thought it smells horrible.
No, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pick a bunch of these flowers. I'm going to bring them back to the studio because I'm such a nice guy. I'm going to give them to you guys. No, but in all seriousness, this flower, it smells. It's not something you're going to plant in your backyard, and certainly nothing you're going to bring into your living room, but they are all over Hawthorne Boulevard here in the city of Lawndale. Basically, the city several years ago, they paid a lot of money to have these plants brought in and planted out here, and now they're considering paying tens of thousands of dollars to have these plants removed. We took these flowers today. We brought them to the residents. This was their reaction. Can you just smell it for me?
Yeah.
That's the smell.
Yeah, yeah, that is.
You like it?
No.
Sniff it.
Yeah, that's the one. Hey, that's it.
Describe it.
Smells like weed, like chronic.
Residents here in Lawndale are getting a big whiff of garlic. Here at the corner of 147th and Hawthorne Boulevard, garlic plants line the center divider. About 8 years ago, the city paid millions to redevelop the main boulevard. That included planting these garlic plants.
It's like skunk. It's like the smell of a skunk.
Some city council members are willing to spend $35,000 of taxpayer money to remove the plants. But city councilman Jim Ramsey thinks that's absurd.
The only reason why we ever had garlic put in was so we could keep the vampires out of town. And since we have had garlic, I haven't seen one single solitary vampire in town.
naturally. After a long day of chasing game, James Osborne found himself deep in the dense Canadian woodlands. It was growing dark, and having lost his bearings, he decided to head in one direction until he was clear of the increasingly oppressive foliage. After what seemed like hours, he came across a cabin in a small clearing. Realizing how dark it had gotten, he decided to inquire about staying the night there. He approached and found the door ajar. Nobody was inside. The hunter collapsed on the single bed, deciding to explain himself to the owner in the morning. As he looked around, he was surprised to see the walls adorned by many portraits, all painted in absurd detail. Without exception, they appeared to be staring down at him, their features twisted into looks of hatred. Staring back, he grew increasingly uncomfortable. Making a concerted effort to ignore the many hateful faces, he turned towards the wall and, exhausted, fell into a restless sleep. Face down in an unfamiliar bed, he turned, blinking in unexpected sunlight. Looking up, he discovered that the cabin had no portraits, only windows. I woke up early to work on the next installment for this project today. I responded to mail, scoured my brain for ideas, carefully arranged sentences, checked facts, even looked up how to pronounce the names of small German towns so as to be as accurate and succinct in my presentation to you, the viewer, as I could be. As I began to record, I found myself growing a little thirsty. I trundled into the cold cellar to fetch myself a soda. Returning with Coke in hand, I retrieved a glass and some ice and placed them on the desk beside me. Pouring the dark, syrupy soda into the glass, I realized something was hanging out of the can. Shaking it caused a few wiry legs to fall from the can and into the drink. Then, the entire body of what I assumed to be a house centipede. Luckily, I still would have noticed even if it hadn't fallen in without a fight, because it landed ever so neatly on the ice cubes. Yeah? Uh-huh. Okay. Mount Pleasant is one of those little suburban communities that seem to have spilled out across the rural Ontario countryside in recent years. Like many of its breed, it contains an endless procession of tidy, reasonably sized houses neatly lined up by the sides of streets with names like Sunnyview Road, Grovewood Drive, and Orange Tree Gate. Even the name of the community itself is unspectacular. As a matter of fact, there are 8 different Mount Pleasants in Ontario alone. However, on the morning of March 12th, 2008, some of its residents awoke to a bewildering surprise. Alongside a small, sleepy road called Emmett Circle, there appeared to be one more streetlight than had illuminated the road the night before. The mysterious lamppost stood as tall and as weather-worn as its neighbors. Even the snow around it seemed undisturbed, although curious locals who drew near enough reported hearing a faint, directionless humming when in close proximity to it. Inquiring calls were placed to the local municipality offices, but all were responded to in befuddled tones. It appeared no one had ordered the unusual nighttime installment. The world continued to turn, though, and the sun set on March 12th, leaving those who witnessed the oddity with no more information than they had had at the beginning of the day. March 13th only brought more mystery, nonetheless. Where the perplexing lamppost had stood the evening before lay only undisturbed virgin snow. Media and the government workers who had been called down to inspect the peculiarity found nothing, and any investigation was ceased, written off for the most part as a community gag. In the days that followed, another strange occurrence gradually surfaced. Pleading signs and posters began to coat any accommodating surface in the streets. Nearly 15 outdoor cats and dogs kept as pets in a surrounding radius of about 2 kilometers were reported missing in the following week. Many of them were last seen sometime between the 11th and the 13th. At birth, male ceratoids are already equipped with extremely well-developed olfactory organs that detect scents in the water. The male ceratoid lives solely to find and mate with the female. They are significantly smaller than the female anglerfish and have trouble finding food in the deep sea. This necessitates his quickly finding a female anglerfish to prevent his death. The sensitive olfactory organs help the male to detect the pheromones that signal the proximity of a female anglerfish. When he finds a female, he bites into her skin and releases an enzyme that digests the skin of his mouth and her body, fusing the pair down to the blood vessel level. The male then slowly atrophies, first losing its digestive organs, then its brain, heart, and eyes, and ends as nothing more than a pair of gonads, which release sperm in response to hormones in the female's bloodstream, indicating egg release. This extreme sexual dimorphism ensures that, when the female is ready to spawn, she has a mate immediately available. I just thought you should know. The following was posted to an anonymous image board at 11:44 yesterday morning, Sunday, January 24th, 2010. I've edited around some of the poorer English. I must have been 6 or 7 when I lived in Lebanon. It's a country that was ravaged by war at the time, and war murders were common and frequent. I remember during a particularly vicious era, when the bombings rarely ever stopped, I would stay at home sitting in front of my television, watching a very, very strange show. It was a kids' show that lasted about 30 minutes and contained strange and sinister images. To this day, I believe it was a thinly veiled attempt on behalf of the media to use scare tactics to keep kids in place, because the moral of each episode revolved around very uptight ideologies. Stuff like, bad kids stay up late, bad kids have their hands under the covers when they sleep, and bad kids steal food from the fridge at night. It was very weird and inarabic to top it off. I didn't understand much of it, but for the most part, the images were very graphic and comprehensive. The thing that stuck with me the most, however, was the closing scene. It remained much the same in every episode. The camera would zoom in on an old, rusted, closed door. The closer it got to the door, the more audible, strange, sometimes even agonizing screams would become. It was extremely frightening, especially for children's programming. Then a text would appear on the screen, in Arabic, reading, "That's where bad kids go." Eventually, both the image and the sound would fade out, and that would be the end of the episode. About 15 or 16 years later, I became a journalistic photographer. That show had been in my mind all my life, popping up in my thoughts sporadically. Eventually, I'd had enough and decided to do some research. I finally managed to uncover the location of the studio where much of that channel's programming had been recorded. Upon further research and eventually traveling on site, I found out it was now desolate and had been abandoned after the big war ended. I entered the building with my camera. It was burnt out from the inside. Either a fire had broken out, or someone had wanted to incinerate all of the wooden furniture. After a few hours of cautiously making my way into the studio and snapping pictures, I found an isolated, out-of-the-way room. After having to break through a few old locks and managing to drag the heavy door open, I remained frozen in the doorway for several long minutes. Traces of blood, feces, and tiny bone fragments lay scattered across the floor. It was a small room and an extremely morbid scene. What truly frightened me, though, what made me turn away and never want to come back, was a bolted, caged microphone hanging from the roof in the middle of the room. If anyone lives in Lebanon and recalls that show and can tell me the name, I'd appreciate it.
Here we are, the local public library. I sure am glad you guys finally decided to come with me.
I wanted to go to the movies.
Don't be angry, Ducky. You'll have a great time if you give the library a chance. There's something here for everybody.
Look at all the books.
That's right, but there's lots more to see.
Pretty colors.
The library has lots of books for everything you need. If you need to look up something, or if you want to read just for fun. It's all here at the library.
How can reading be fun?
When you read a book, your imagination is better than watching TV or going to a movie because you can almost see what the book is talking about. It's really great. And I really love books with happy endings.
Well, what else do they have here?
prominently displayed in the children's section of the Houston Downtown Public Library. Among several others of the same title, My First Cookbook appears as a run-of-the-mill children's cookbook, complete with large print, simple instructions, colorful, friendly illustrations, and a somewhat disproportionate dessert section. In fact, the only major deviation from this theme is a single article near the end of the book entitled A Recipe for Success. This is a complex, macabre ritual involving human sacrifice, self-mutilation, and sacrilege, as well as more curious and innocuous practices, such as walking down a staircase with a prime number of stairs, 2 at a time, and then returning up 3 at a time. It's written in the same cheerfully simple prose as the rest of the book, and is accompanied by the same helpful pastel drawings. During the summer of 1983, in a quiet town near Minneapolis, Minnesota, the charred body of a woman was found inside the kitchen stove of a small farmhouse. A video camera was also found in the kitchen, standing on a tripod and pointing at the oven. No tape was found inside the camera at the time. Although the scene was originally labeled as a homicide by police, an unmarked VHS tape was later discovered at the bottom of the farm's well, which had apparently dried up earlier that year. Despite its worn condition and the fact that it contained no audio, police were still able to view the contents of the tape. It depicted a woman recording herself in front of a video camera, presumably the same camera that police had found in the kitchen. After positioning the camera to include both her and her kitchen stove in the footage, the tape then showed her turning on the oven, opening the door, crawling inside, and then closing the door behind her. 8 minutes into the video, the oven could be seen shaking violently, after which point thick black smoke could be seen emanating from it. For the remaining 45 minutes of video, until the batteries in the camera died, it remained in its stationary position. To avoid disturbing the local community, police never officially released any information about the tape, or even the fact that it was found. Police were also not able to determine who had put the tape in the well, or why the height and stature of the woman in the video didn't come close to matching the body they'd found in the oven. For most of the time we've lived here, we've relied on an old, yellowing answering machine that employed a cassette-based system. More recently, that old answering machine collapsed under the weight of its years and had to be replaced by a sleek, shiny, digital one. As is commonly the case with new technology, new problems seem to have surfaced. This answering machine seems to pick up a bit of noise that the previous one didn't. It's not always present, and a lot of the time when it is, it's barely audible at all. However, the noises it does pick up are peculiar. Before I play a recording picked up on the machine last week, please remember that I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything, nor am I making any claims about EVPs or the paranormal. I'm simply documenting this uncomfortable phenomenon here. Please listen carefully, as the noise is sparse and inconsistent.
You have one whole message. Monday, 9:13 a.m. Hi, it's Sherry calling from our office. Just returning your call for an appointment. We do have daytime appointments available Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday this week between 9:30 and 3:30 is normally our last appointment. If you need an evening appointment, I have Dr. Kirsten working on Thursday, and I do have at this point a 7:15 available, and I have a 4:30 available on Thursday evening. So I'm in the office normally 9 till 3 today, but I am battling a sore back. I don't know if I'm going to last all day or not, but please feel free to call back, and we'll try and set something up that accommodate you. Thanks very much. The number here is 9274. Thanks very much. Bye now. End of messages.
In Berlin, after World War II, money was short, supplies were tight, and it seemed like everyone was hungry. At that time, people were telling the tale of a young woman who saw a blind man picking his way through the crowd. The two started to talk. The man asked her for a favor. Could she deliver his letter to the address on its envelope? It was on her way home, so she agreed. She started out to deliver the message when she turned around to see if there was anything else the blind man needed. But she spotted him hurrying through the crowd without his smoky glasses or his white cane. She went to the police, who raided the address on the envelope, where they found heaps of human flesh for sale. And what was in the envelope? A message reading, "This is the last one I am sending you today." Would you like to watch a clip from Meat Love by Jan Schwankmeyer? Great. If you didn't know, Jan Schwankmeyer is a renowned Czech surrealist artist who has produced many motion pictures, including Alice and Little Otek, in which Meat Love appears as a mock commercial. The short film features two animate slices of steak interacting, dancing, and then rolling together in flour in a way suggestive of sexual intercourse. I'll even spoil the end for you. The two ultimately wind up perishing in a frying pan. It always grossed me out to look at that much raw meat, though.
Cause it's not junior high anymore, and I don't like 9-inch nails no more. Don't fucking talk to me, cause I don't want to read your poetry. I just can't wait to get out on the sand, rubbing suntan lotion on my man. I need to shake my snatch if I'm going to get any action. I can't wait, I can't wait, I can't wait for summer. I can't wait, I can't wait, I can't wait for summer.
The Little Fears will be back in business on the very first day of summer, the 21st of June, 2010. The numbers are staggering. According to a recent article in the Albany Times Union, there are 30,000 unsolved murder cases in the state of New York. Author Brian Fitzgerald writes that these make up 10% of all unsolved murder cases in the United States. The trend carries from coast to coast. Unsolved murders ranging in the thousands take place every year in every corner of the country. Take, for example, California. Capital Weekly reports that half of all Californian murders, more than 1,000 per year, go unsolved. Amongst their ranks, and still remaining unsolved to this day, are the murders of Michael and Stephanie Stafford and Jessica Campbell of Thousand Oaks, California. On June 1st, 1997, David and Alice Stafford decided on spending a relaxing Friday night together. A rendition of the World War II-based dramatic comedy Mr. Roberts had recently started showing at the Conejo Players Theater. Tickets were just $10 each. David called Jessica Campbell, the 16-year-old daughter of a close neighbor, and the Stafford family's go-to babysitter. She showed up at 7:15 sharp. As Alex Stafford helped her two young children into their pajamas, David casually reviewed the children's bedtime with Jessica and reminded her that she could watch cable in the living room once the children were asleep, before ushering his wife out the door. David didn't talk to Jessica again until after 11, when he called from a theater payphone to make sure everything was all right. Jessica picked up on the second ring and assured him that Michael and Stephanie had gotten to sleep by 8:30, before slyly asking permission to retrieve a bowl of ice cream from the refrigerator. David approved the request and had nearly hung up the phone when Jessica quickly blurted out a second inquiry. Jessica asked if she could cover up the new statue just outside the living room window. She confided that she'd been watching a true crime show and that the silhouette of the statue in her peripheral vision kept making her feel uneasy. David Stafford asked Jessica which statue she was referring to. A moment of silence followed, and then David told Jessica to check on the children before hanging up the receiver. Police reports show that a panicked 911 call was placed from the Conejo Players Theater at 11:17, courtesy of a David Stafford. David gathered his wife and raced home, arriving 5 minutes after the police, but even they hadn't been quick enough to make a difference. Neither Jessica nor the two young Stafford children were alive by the time David pushed past the police and into the front door of his own house. As with over 1,000 other unsolved murders in California that year, no one was ever prosecuted. And if you're curious, they actually did find a statue. There were no fingerprints on it, though. In 1626, Sir Francis Bacon died of pneumonia while attempting to freeze a chicken by stuffing it full of snow. On the 11th of July, 1804, Alexander Hamilton, former U.S. Secretary, was shot to death by U.S. Vice President Aaron Burr in a pistol duel. In 1984, Jim Fixx, the man famous for popularizing jogging, died of a heart attack. Come on, you know this one. While jogging. In 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer, mass murderer, was beaten to death with a broomstick by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institute. As humans, our deaths could occur at any time. If we're lucky, we'll die doing something that we love, like Jim Fixx and his jogging, or I suppose Francis Bacon and his chicken. Alas, death is never predictable. And nobody ever dies of a broken heart, right? In the late 18th century, when Peter Labilliere, a handsome and bright young London tutor, fell in love, it was with a woman who wanted nothing to do with him. Despite his loving overtures, she refused him coldly. Not long after, with her rejection still fresh in his mind, he forsook teaching forever and joined the Marines. During his service, he excelled and rose to the rank of major, where he became quite well known for his eccentric nature and dress. After leaving the service, he moved to Dorking, where he lived as a tenant in the home of a widow by the name of Watford. Here, the extra income he provided proved a useful supplement to her wages as a seamstress, needing, as she did, to provide for herself and 5 children. Despite his strange nature, Labilliere and the Duke of Devonshire remained lifelong friends. Peter Labilliere visited punctually each year on the 6th of June, staying exactly 1 month. Unusually, his visit in 1799 was extended to 3 months. Upon returning home, he informed his landlady that he had come back to live and die with her, and that he would depart this life 9 months to the day. Almost immediately, his health began to fail, and as the fateful day approached, he began to suffer greatly. On the predicted day, he stretched out his arms, gently folded them, and died. Major Peter Labilliere was to be buried on Box Hill in Surrey. The Major himself had obtained permission from then-owner Henry Peters to be buried upon his favorite spot, where he had passed long periods in meditation by the side of the hill. As a matter of fact, on one such visit he had lost his footing, falling into the dense undergrowth and losing the sight of one eye, but even that hadn't changed his opinion of the place. But this wasn't the end of his list of burial requests. Labilliere's grave had been dug days earlier, resembling a well. The Major had insisted on being buried 100 feet beneath the surface of the earth, facing downwards towards its center. On the morning of his funeral, the 11th of June, 1800, 2 carts, one laden with sprigs of box and the other with sprigs of yew, passed through the town. All who so desired were encouraged to avail themselves of the evergreens as they made their way to the burial, where the 2 young children of his landlady, whom he had been educating in religious matters, danced on his coffin. The sprigs of yew and box, believed in darker times to represent both immortality and a safe passage into the afterlife, were then tossed into the grave before the inverted remains of the Major were placed upon them. In 1809, American General Anthony Wayne's only son Isaac made the 900-mile round trip from Wayne-Chester County to Presque Isle to retrieve his father's remains. Originally buried in an oak coffin on Presque Isle, a peninsula off Lake Erie, western Pennsylvania, Anthony Wayne was dug up. Upon exhuming his body, they found him remarkably well preserved, despite being buried in the wet, moist soil of a small island. So well preserved, in fact, that a close friend of Anthony Wayne in life, Dr. J.C. Wallace, had to dissect the 12 years buried body before boiling the flesh from the bones. Wayne's son then took his father's bones back to native Chester County to bury them in a family plot, his flesh once more buried in Presque Isle soil, where it rests till this day. What did these men have in common? Both the English Major, Peter Labilliere, and the American General, Anthony Wayne, served in the American Revolutionary War at the same time. They even died within 3 short years of each other. Both had long, successful military careers plagued by rumors of eccentricity, but the clearest connections are in their elaborate burial rites. In the way Anthony Wayne's well-preserved corpse was disassembled 12 years after its initial burial, and the parts were divided amongst 2 graves, hundreds of miles apart from each other. In the way Peter Labilliere, a dedicated man of faith, ensured that his 100-foot-deep grave was to be filled with sprigs of yew and box, plants believed to help a soul travel from one world to the next, before his body was placed upside down in the deep pit and buried. It almost seems as if great pains had been undertaken on behalf of both men to ensure that their bodies could never rise once more from their graves. As if each had seen something amongst the chaotic fires of the Battle of Paoli, or rotting in the deadly prison ships of New York, that had made them think such a thing were possible, to have seen it so clearly that they could predict to the day when their ends would come. But no, death is sudden, unpredictable, and no one ever dies of a broken heart. Now, when Thomas Baker tries to look back, he can't recall a single detail in the face of the man who ended his childhood sense of wonder. The mall Santa, who he had asked for a Sega Genesis 16 years earlier. Thomas learned that Santa Claus didn't really exist on the day that it came, when his parents looked at the unwrapped gift with a wide-eyed terror and asked him if he knew who had brought it into their home. They had only unwrapped it after the detectives had gone back home to their families with no more information about Thomas's missing brother, Chris, than they had started with that morning. That was when a remark Thomas had earlier ignored came to mind. One Santa had made, after he'd asked old St. Nick for the coveted entertainment system in the mall the week before. He couldn't remember the face of the man, but the smell of his breath remains in his memory, even now. Okay, but I'll have to eat your little brother first. His breath smelled like pennies and gasoline. It was almost sweet and intoxicating. It gave Thomas a headache. Only a few chewed and broken child-sized bones turned up that spring, after all the snow had melted. They were never able to confirm that they had belonged to Chris. Thomas's parents were divorced by then.
Parliament Hill is a scenic location on the southern banks of the Ottawa River in downtown Ottawa, Ontario. Its Gothic Revival suite of buildings serves as the home of the Parliament of Canada. As one of the best-known symbols in Canada, Parliament Hill has 3 buildings, the Centre, East, and West Block, and is a site of architectural beauty, historical significance, and federal decision-making.
Every country clings to a few old laws that don't seem to make a lot of sense in the modern world. For example, in Britain, it's illegal for a member of Parliament to enter the House of Commons while wearing a full suit of armour. In Victoria, British Columbia, it's illegal for street musicians to give children balloons. In Toronto, Ontario, it's illegal to drag the dead body of a horse through Yonge Street. Only on Sundays, though, oddly enough. The Centre Block, Canada's main legislative building on Parliament Hill, burnt down during the bitterly cold night of February 3rd, 1916. The only part of the original Centre Block that remains today is the Library of Congress. The rest has since been rebuilt. It was during the rebuilding that the House of Commons passed a law regarding a bathroom in the basement of the Centre Block. You probably don't know, but there's one tiny old bathroom below the Library of Congress with bare brick walls and no electric lighting. There's been a lock on the door since the 1970s, but still, to this day, it's illegal for any unmarried man to enter that cramped little room. By the beginning of October 1997, Ashley Krause was sure that there were rats in her apartment. More than once, tiny rat droppings had greeted her on her white linoleum bathroom floor. She found one of her dish towels all chewed up into ribbons on the same morning she found a bent fork outside of her bedroom door. Ashley shuddered at the thought of a rat so near to her bedroom before pondering this strange new behavior. She had never actually had rats before. Ashley wanted traps, the snappy kind. At the hardware store, she went for a brand name, Victor Easy Set Rat Traps, a 12-pack, on sale for $25. Ashley set the traps in various corners of her apartment, sneaking one beneath the kitchen sink, one in her closet, and one in her cupboard. However, all of them went unsprung until November 1st, when Ashley woke up to find the small corpse of a rat broken in the metal vise of one of her traps. Strangely, though, the rat had been picked clean of its meat. The term Rat King is used to describe a gigantic tangle of rats all knotted together by their tails. It comes from Germany, where an Altenburg museum keeps the mummified remains of a 200-year-old rat king, discovered in a German miller's fireplace, which consists of 32 rats in total. In German folklore, a rat king is considered an extremely bad omen. Ashley didn't know any of this when she discovered the dried remains of 13 rats knotted together by their tails, neatly hidden between her bookshelf and the wall on December 4th. Here's a picture of a rat king for reference. You know, there was one major difference between this and the one Ashley found. None of the rats in the Rat King had much flesh left hanging from their skeletons, like the trapped rat Ashley had found earlier. When she regained her nerve, she turned a garbage bag inside out, placed it over the mass of tiny bodies, and tried to scoop them up into the bag, while avoiding touching the mass at all costs. That's how she cleaned it up. Ashley worked for a corporate catering company called Catering Casual. As the end of December loomed overhead, business became busier and busier. Her 9-to-5, Sundays and Mondays off job stretched into a grueling marathon of 12-hour days, as it did every year around the holiday season. By December 22nd, 1997, Ashley Krause had worked 15 consecutive days. She went to bed completely exhausted. The sound of scraping woke her up. Ashley lay half awake in the abrupt silence that followed and wondered if she'd really heard anything at all. As she listened, she was torn between going back to sleep and checking out the apartment to see if something really had made up. Noise. Flicking on her bedside lamp, she opened her bedroom door and spilled light out into the hallway. A filthy, gigantic brown rat scurried past her bare feet and into her room. Something in the hallway dropped a fork onto the floor. In December 2001, a website supposedly founded by a Catholic school teacher from British Columbia started getting a lot of attention on a couple paranormal-themed message boards. The website claimed that a number of young children, mainly kindergarten and first grade students from a small Victoria area school, had begun acting strangely during class. Apparently, as many as 15 students all started exhibiting emotionally unstable and volatile behavior within the span of a month. In two extreme cases, the author of the website mentioned students repeatedly and spontaneously urinating or defecating during lessons, having never shown signs of such behavior before. According to the earliest posts on the website, when concerned teachers tried to console the distressed students or understand their dramatic shift in behavior, a striking trend emerged. Again and again, young students claimed to be followed by stick men. Almost all of the children who made this claim struggled to further explain the nature of these stick men, but one boy offered the insight that they were sticks that had lots more little sticks for arms. In an uncertain attempt to try and discern the nature of this unusual issue, or perhaps to sate their own curiosity, the teachers asked a few of the troubled students to draw their imaginary tormentors. But the result only puzzled them further. The anonymous author of the website claimed that he posted photographs of these illustrations in the hopes of finding some link between the common fears of his students. Maybe an age-inappropriate horror movie or some other thing that would have connected the otherwise seemingly isolated events. Yet only a few months later, on May 20th, 2002, the site was taken down and never restored. The reason for the sudden discontinuation of the website was never disclosed, but 3 days earlier, on May 17th, an 8-year-old boy from rural Victoria disappeared from his bedroom while his parents slept. He was never seen again. Okay, so around this time of year, when I was in high school, I think 11th grade, there was this girl I knew who made this sort of dummy thing for an art project. I don't really know what the assignment was, but she made this life-size doll type thing by wrapping herself up in tons of plastic wrap and then cutting herself out of it and then taping the shape back up. If you can imagine that. So she called this thing Carol, and she put some dirty clothes on it and some makeup and a Halloween costume wig that you get from a drugstore or whatever, you know, to make it look kind of spooky, or like what some high school kid would think is spooky. And she was super proud of it, though, and she talked about it all the time. And she would joke about how she would treat Carol as if she was a human being and all this stuff. But I never saw Carol until our art teacher made her take it home early because it was making him feel uncomfortable, which of course was a huge point of pride for my friend. She lived on the same street as me at the time, and so we'd walk home together a lot. So when she had to drag Carol home, that's when I got my introduction. She was life-sized, but she didn't really weigh anything. I mean, the jeans were the heaviest part. The trick was keeping her off the ground, and my friend was so proud of Carol that she didn't want to drag her, so we took turns carrying her on our shoulders. The way she looked honestly didn't creep me out, but carrying her definitely felt weird. She was super light, but I guess the wind kind of caught her and made her arms and legs move a bit. That creeped me out. On the way home, we stopped at a playground to sit down and chat for a bit. We propped Carol up against a pole, laughing at what some kid would think if they saw her. I took a cell phone pic, and then we walked over to the other side of the park to swings, giving Carol a bit of space to see if some unsuspecting child would walk up to her. We fiddled around on the swings and talked about school and stuff for a while, mostly just killing time to see if some kids would come around. But the weather was kind of crap, so the park stayed empty aside from us. After about 20 minutes, it started really raining, and so we gave up on the whole plan. We grabbed our bags and walked back over to where we'd left Carol, but Carol wasn't there anymore. My friend was pretty upset about it. So we looked for Carol, of course, but it was kind of pointless. We were both getting soaked, and we still had another 10 minutes to walk home, so we sort of gave up. It doesn't make sense, but I'm pretty sure that nobody had taken her. Nobody could have. We were watching the sidewalk the whole time. We joked that she just sort of walked off. It was a funny thought, trying to imagine Carol walking with her bent up, multi-jointed legs. We tried to mimic it and laughed pretty hard. I still have that picture of Carol, though. On a beautifully sunny day in early October 1965, a little girl named Susan Wright disappeared from her parents' farm in Belle Plaine, Saskatchewan. She'd only been out of her mother's sight for a moment, running up ahead into the underbrush while playing with the family dog. But searches turned up no clues, and eventually it was thought that she'd been kidnapped. The next week, word came from the nearby town of Moose Jaw that a girl had been found who matched Susan's description. The overjoyed Wright family rushed to claim their daughter, only to discover that the girl didn't seem to recognize them, and in fact, that she refused to speak at all. Despite this worrying change in Susan, they returned with her to their home, where their neighbors recognized her, and the local authorities were satisfied that she was indeed Susan Wright. The case was closed. Then, in November, a farmer crossing a local field discovered the mutilated body of a young girl. The corpse could not be identified, but her parents recognized Susan's clothes. The Times-Herald reported, although it would seem almost impossible that the parents would make such a mistake, the Wrights are now uncertain whether the child they've been nursing for more than a month is really their own. Police are faced by a threefold task: to discover the murderer, to identify the murdered child, and if she is indeed proven to be Susan Wright, discover the identity of the little girl that they'd accidentally abducted from Moose Jaw. I can't find any evidence that they succeeded. It seems like a nightmare. You're the parent of a 6-year-old boy. He's friendly and outgoing and active. Recently he's been sick with strep throat, but in the last couple of days he's been feeling better. Until you wake up early in the morning to the sound of him screaming, and you can't do anything to calm him down. From what you can gather, he's terrified of something crawling into his nose and his ears and his mouth and his eyes. Spiders or centipedes or germs. He's inconsolable and constantly in fear. Over the next few days, things just get worse. He refuses to eat because he's afraid there's things living in his food and that they'll go inside of him. He's afraid to leave his room, and his fits become more violent. Eventually, he has to be hospitalized. Infections like strep can cross the blood-brain barrier and inflame delicate parts of a child's brain. It's called pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with strep, and it's able to cause severe symptoms of OCD in children. But the sudden onset of mental illness in children can occur in a number of ways. Underlying issues sometimes surface during a period of extreme stress or after an injury, issues that can sometimes never be fully resolved. Hopefully, an unnamed 14-year-old boy will learn to manage his obsessive behavior, but he struggled to for years. His mother writes that he has seemed like a completely different person since his head injury. The boy was injured at a sleepover party in the bathroom, where the children were playing Bloody Mary in the mirror, one at a time. The others held the door shut. He panicked and fell back into the tub, banging his head hard off the tap. He was found unconscious and didn't wake up until the next day. But when he did, he couldn't stand to be around any reflective surface. He has since suffered from the debilitating paranoid delusion that he's being watched through every mirror. The fear is very real to him. He suffers from immobilizing panic attacks and has to be medicated for his constant anxiety. The medication helps, but the only way he'll ever be able to truly manage his fear is through cognitive behavioral therapy, by training himself to recognize that his fears are irrational and misplaced, and that he can work past them. But his paranoia is deeply rooted, and he struggles hard to shake the belief that the faint, moving shapes he believes he can make out in every reflection are watching, waiting until he's completely alone to come back out through the glass.